please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicholas Cronk.
Andrew, thank you very much for your too generous introduction. But Andrew and I were fellows together in Paris, I think, 3 years ago, and we started a dialogue then about French Enlightenment things. So this is, in a way, carrying on our discussion. So it's a huge pleasure to be here, and thank you very, very much for your introduction. Can everyone hear me without a microphone? Is it clear? Okay, if you don't hear, then please wave. I've taken the challenge that was set to introduce a seminar discussion. So I'm going to talk about something, quite a broad subject. And I'm very aware, as I reread my notes this morning, that it's actually full of holes, but I've left this as something which will pose questions that we can discuss afterwards, because I'm covering quite a wide range. And the topic I've chosen is something that I've been puzzling about for the last couple of years. There's an old chestnut in historiography, which is the connection between the philosophe and the revolution. To what extent did the thinking of the Enlightenment cause, or influence, or shape the French Revolution? I'm not discussing that, but there's a by question of that. So that could be another seminar. But there's a subset of that question which has fascinated me, which is when we talk broadly about the philosophe and the Enlightenment, which philosophe in particular do we mean? In other words, what is the relative pecking order of the different philosophes? And that's something which is not so much written about, and since I work on Voltaire, it's something that's come to interest me. It strikes me that Diderot is someone, I'll come back to him, whose stock has risen slightly. There are other philosophers who are always mentioned, like d'Alembert and Buffon, but they're always mentioned in the second rank. There are only really two philosophers whose position moves wildly within the constellation. One is Rousseau, and I won't talk much about Rousseau because that's another lecture, but Rousseau's position is complicated but known. I mean, Rousseau is an important thinker, the social contract and so forth, but he's not fully, with both feet, in the camp of the philosophe. So the argument about Rousseau is he or isn't he a full-blooded philosophe? To what extent is he against or with some of their views? So those are arguments that are well known. In the case of Voltaire, the question is very much really, is he or is he not the leader of the movement? So it's a different sort of, whereas Rousseau's problematic relationship with the group is a horizontal relationship, Voltaire's problematic relationship is a sort of a vertical one. So I'll just start with an image. This image is often used in textbooks as a typical example of the 18th century French salon. Well, if you've read Antoine Lilti's book on the French salon, that has been completely debunked. This is an imagination of the salon done in 1812. Le Monnier was commissioned to paint this for Empress Josephine, in fact. But it's meant to be a salon of Madame Geoffrin. All the famous writers and aristocrats, note the mixing, are present. What exactly is going on is that the character in red is Lequin, the most famous tragic actor of the period, and he is reading Voltaire's tragedy L'Orphelin de la Chine. Oh yeah, that's better, thank you. And of course, so all these, the entire assembly of Madame Geoffrin's salon is listening to Voltaire's tragedy. And I just think it's a wonderful example of Voltaire's ambiguous presence within the Enlightenment grouping. Voltaire is absent. He's the one person who's not here. But of course he is here because, first of all, he's present in the form of a bust. So he actually presides over the whole thing. And the reason they've come together is to listen to Voltaire's tragedy read by the greatest tragedian of the day. So Voltaire manages to be both present and absent. And that ambiguity is quite interesting about his position more generally. I think it would be right to say that in the early years of the Enlightenment, Montesquieu clearly is the predominant figure. He has huge intellectual heft as a result of l'Esprit des lois in the 1740s. Also, his aristocratic presence is part of that as well. He's untouchable because of his social status. But things get interesting, as it were, when Montesquieu dies in February 1755. The encyclopédistes, Diderot, d'Alembert, and their team, idolize Montesquieu. And they immediately write this very extravagant Éloge de Montesquieu when he dies, which is rushed into the frontispiece of volume 5 of the Encyclopédie, which appears later that year. It's a huge public statement of Montesquieu's importance. Voltaire doesn't exactly comment on it, but he clearly notices it, and you notice a certain certain tepid warmth about it. Voltaire clearly thinks that the praise of Montesquieu is ever so slightly overdone, and later on Voltaire will get quite critical of aspects of Montesquieu. In any case, the death of Montesquieu in 55 leaves Voltaire de facto as the leader of the philosophes. There is no one else of his stature. Remember that Voltaire is significantly a few years older than Diderot and Rousseau and the others. So just by virtue of his fame, his publications and his age, Voltaire becomes the leader of the philosophes in 1755. And over the next nearly 20 years, through the late 50s and through the 1760s, Voltaire is, without any question, the dominant representative of the philosophe movement in France. And will be seen, this word radical we'll have to talk about in the discussion afterwards, what does it really mean, but he was seen as the most cutting-edge, vocal representative of the points of view of the philosophe. Right at the end of his life, so Voltaire dies in 1778, he's by their standards of the period, a very old man by then. In the late 1770s, he begins to be regarded by some of the philosophers being a bit too old. They say he repeats himself. They begin to say that he's not as radical as he used to be. So there's a slight tailing off of his radical status towards the end of his life. Voltaire dies in 1778. And then, of course, within only a decade, the French Revolution, and as the Revolution looks for its intellectual ancestors, the author they go back to primarily is Voltaire. Of course, they go back to Rousseau as well, the social contract. But to begin with, it is actually Voltaire who is made the hero of the Revolution. The decision is made to create the Panthéon as the great sort of building that will memorialise the great men of France. And the first author to be put into the Panthéon is Voltaire. In 1791, it's one of the great... it's one of the great... I'm looking at the wrong screen. It's one of the great ceremonies of the French Revolution. A procession of Voltaire's tomb was carried through Paris over several days. The tomb was laying in the Place de la Bastille on the rubble of the Bastille, it's all vastly symbolic. And then it moved from the Place de la Bastille along the Seine to the Panthéon, stopping in various places, exactly mimicking the Stations of the Cross. So the procession mimicked a Christian procession. So that the Saint Voltaire was then installed in what had been built as a Christian church for Louis XV originally. And here you see the body of Voltaire arriving at the Panthéon. Now, if you go, and of course the coffin is still there, it can still be visited in the vaults, and you just have to look at the coffin to see how the Revolution has created Voltaire. Poète, historien, philosophe, il agrandit l'esprit humain et lui a appris qu'il devait être libre. A poet, historian, philosopher, he enlarged the human spirit and taught human beings that they had how to be free. So that's a pretty clear manifesto. And then on the other side of the coffin, he fought atheists and fanatics. Very interesting how they position him in religious terms. He fought atheists and fanatics. He inspired tolerance. He demanded the rights of man against the servitude of feudalism. Again, it's a very, very forceful political statement. I wonder how many committees met in order to decide the wording on the coffin, but it's a very, very striking statement. And there's an example of how in 1791, it's still quite early in the Revolution, there's a very clear image of how Voltaire is to be interpreted. And of course, I'll say just the obvious point in passing, of course Voltaire would not have recognised much of this. But Voltaire's been created as this very radical figure for the Revolution. Rousseau will be the second figure to be put in the Panthéon, but 2 years later. So Rousseau follows, but it is interesting that they start with Voltaire. Even in his lifetime, Voltaire had been a huge European-wide celebrity. And when, of course, the revolution happens, it sends, you know this better than I do, it sends shockwaves across Europe. And when you look at how people respond to the revolution in other European countries, it is just striking how often the name of Voltaire comes up. So, and on both sides of the political divide. So, in England, for example, William Godwin writes The Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, great radical tract of freedom in 1793, as a response to the revolution. Voltaire is the writer that is mentioned in the footnotes more than anyone else. From the other side, in Italy, there's an anonymous Italian book published in Venice in 1791 a response to the pantheonization of Voltaire, called Voltaire à l'Assemblée Nationale, which is just a complete character assassination of Voltaire, saying he's a godless philosopher whose ambition and envy and dislike of Catholicism has caused the chaos of the revolution. So it's a straight Catholic demolition of the revolution, but taking Voltaire as the central figure. So again, Voltaire, his prominence in the revolutionary sort of pantheon is there also in the responses to the revolution. The 19th century reception of Voltaire is fascinating, but it can be summed up fairly simply. He remains a very, very radical figure within the context of 19th century French politics. So after Napoleon, there is a sort of, as you know better than I do, there's this cleavage between the left and the right, broadly defined by the army versus the church, the republic versus the monarchy. And in that sort of left versus right split that emerges in the 19th century, Voltaire is always seen as the figure of the left. He represents the forces that are anti-church, anti-army, anti-monarchy, which, of course, Voltaire was a monarchist, pro the republic. And all the great writers who are polemically engaged in politics in France, Victor Hugo, when he campaigns for an end to capital punishment, he quite overtly alludes to Voltaire. So Hugo is very deliberately imitating Voltaire's campaigning. When you get to the Dreyfus affair in the 1890s, and Dreyfus campaigns, Zola campaigns for Dreyfus, again Zola very deliberately models himself on Voltaire. So Voltaire's radical status is replicated by other crusading writers like Hugo and Zola. But in retrospect, the Dreyfus affair brings about a turning point in the way that Voltaire is seen. And this is something which I think in the literature, so Voltaire's radical status in the 19th century I'm making what is, I think, a fairly obvious point. It's there for everyone to see. I think what's been less obvious or less talked about is the fact that from about 1900, in the wake of the Dreyfus affair, through to the end of the 20th century, various forces actually combined to make Voltaire appear as a less radical figure than he'd seemed to the Revolution and to the 19th century. And the turning point is of someone who is probably not known to historians and is only known to literary historians as a figure of fun, and this is Gustave Lanson. Now, Gustave Lanson was remembered as a great reforming university professor at the Sorbonne, who, in the huge upheavals of the French university in the middle of the Third Republic, where history was the dominant art subject, was trying to defend the teaching of literature, which had a very bad reputation because literature had been taught as a sort of spelletrism, really, as sort of gentlemen, and it was men, gentlemen talking about books in a rather untheorized way. And Lanson understood that it was necessary to give literary study a sort of theoretical basis if it was going to hold its head up against history, which was all dominant in the newly rebuilt Sorbonne, the new buildings that were built in the 1890s. And Lanson is now remembered as the man who was unremittingly positivist, who taught his students how to use fiche when they wrote their thesis. So that has become the joke. He was the ficheman, Peggy called him. So he's remembered as a figure of fun. He also wrote a very, very boring textbook called Histoire littérature française, which again is hugely ridiculed. So no one takes Lanson seriously. But in fact, he's a very, very fascinating figure. He began his life not as a university teacher, but as a lycée teacher. And he taught all through his 30s and 40s. He was a lycée teacher in all sorts of provincial towns. And he worried about secondary teaching and syllabuses. He basically invented the explication de texte, which is still the standard thing in French teaching. And up until the Dreyfus affair, Lanson was essentially someone who taught the standard 17th century syllabus. So great French literature, but even under the Third Republic, was still you taught Racine, you taught Bossuet, you taught Molière, these great figures of Louis XIV. I need to cover a lot of ground quickly, so just to put a few dates together so you can get a sense of it. Lanson begins to become a university teacher in 1900, and in 1904 he finally becomes a professor at the Sorbonne. He's already well past middle age by the time he becomes a professor. And when he becomes a professor in 1904, he announces that his inaugural series will be on Voltaire. So again, it's very simple. Going back, when Zola published J'accuse in L'Aurore in 1898 in defense of Dreyfus, there was a petition. And this petition was signed by all the historians at the Sorbonne and by none of the literary historians, who were much more right-wing, apart from Lanson. And Lanson was one of the first literary historians to sign the petition. So in other words, he breaks ranks with the conservative literature colleagues and lines up with the more radical history colleagues. And essentially, and of course then there's this huge political turnaround. The radicals win the election in 1902, Cronk becomes prime minister, the head of the Bloc de Gauche, separation of church and state overseen by Cronk in 1905. That's all the political context in which Lanson has decided that he will teach Voltaire at the Sorbonne. Now, the context of this is that in the 1890s, Lanson had written textbooks on Bossuet and on all the 17th century Christian writers. So in other words, Lanson suddenly becomes radicalized and becomes an 18th century specialist as a result of the Dreyfus affair. And he begins to give classes about the Enlightenment. So, for example, he writes an article in 1903 which is essentially on the question of what is the appropriate period of literature to teach school students in the Third Republic. So in 1903, this is just after the victory of the radicals and the arrival of Combes in power. So it will be an absurdity to teach Christian monarchical literature in order to educate a democracy which knows no state religion. Writers from the reign of Louis XIV, like Boileau or Racine or La Fontaine or Madame de Sévigné, from those writers you wouldn't get one single grade of patriotic or socially minded thought. Now, it's a very stirring, striking statement. What he doesn't quite say is that he himself, as a lycée teacher in the 1890s, had written textbooks on Boileau and Racine and the others. So in other words, this is a complete change of heart on the part of the lycée teacher, who's now become the radicalized professor at the Sorbonne. And that article continues. I think, by the way, this is an absolutely fascinating text. It's almost impossible to find. I think I've decided I need to publish a little anthology of these texts because they're so interesting. So then he moves on to the 18th century. We recognize in the 18th century, ce temps-là, the origins of the intellectual and social order that we are now living through. So this is, in other words, this is it's actually post the radical victory of 1902 and the arrival of Combes in power. We're now living the moment of the Enlightenment. We recognize the feelings which are still today the motives of our action. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau, Buffon, notice that the order of Voltaire comes first, are nearer to us, they are better for instructing our children and for understanding our heritage than Bossuet and Racine, the two writers on whom he'd written textbooks only a decade before. So this is a most extraordinary rhetorical move. Lanson was much hated by certain people, notably Charles Péguy, who says very acidly, Lanson, this is what amounts to a huge U-turn. Péguy says Lanson has so many different careers. But of course, Lanson really puts his name behind this idea of teaching the 18th century. Now, you might think, and just quickly to finish that, as I mentioned that old chestnut at the beginning of my talk, he also says, in 1903, how do we understand the connection of 18th century literature to the revolution? So in his thinking, he's also beginning to think about that question that Mornay will take up in the 1930s, about the connection of the philosophe and the revolution. Now, in one sense, of course, this seems straightforward. There is a political change in France. Voltaire now comes onto the syllabus. Lanson lectures on Voltaire at the Sorbonne for the first time. He writes a textbook in 1906. He produces a critical edition of the Lettres philosophiques, which becomes a major text for this reforming movement of teaching the 18th century to school students and to university students. So in one sense, it brings Voltaire to the fore more than it had been before. But it comes in a way at a cost, because actually what Lanson is doing, he's a teacher, I mean, he's a very practical man. And it brings Voltaire to the fore, but at the cost of presenting a slightly tamed Voltaire, which is appropriate for using in lycées and universities. So, what are the texts that are taught by Lanson? Well, not the really radical anti-Christian texts, of which there are some which are really, even today, quite breathtaking. The Sermon des Cinquante, the text like that. Lanson doesn't discuss that at all. He talks about the tragedies. Oh, that's fine. I mean, they're very gently polemical. He talks about the contes philosophiques, like Candide, which again are radical but are funny and they're easy to read. And the school editions of Candide were also Bowdlerized. In other words, they got rid of the most obscene language, the things that actually make the text a little bit radical. I think the first school edition of Candide that wasn't Bowdlerized is as late as the 1990s. So it was fine to give school children Candide, but only in a slightly rewritten and tamed form. And then the Lettres philosophiques, which again is a text, it's a wonderful teaching text, a text where Voltaire writes about England and compares England and France. But again, it's absolutely perfect for the years before the First World War, the years of the Entente Cordiale, when England and France are joining up to be a force against Germany. Yeah, it's hugely ideological, but it's not Voltaire's most radical text. And so the paradoxical result of Lanson's pushing of Voltaire in the university system was to produce a Voltaire that was actually slightly tame. Now, Lanson's, when you discuss ideas of the Enlightenment, it's very rare for anyone to ever mention Lanson. The reason I began to think about this was actually my colleague in Oxford, John Robertson, who in fact was a colleague in Oxford, who's now gone to a chair in Cambridge. It was he who said to me once in a seminar, well, you know, it was Lanson, it was modern linguists. He's a historian, so he has this label. He said it was modern linguists who get the Enlightenment going as a subject. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, it's Lanson. So he's just written a very nice short essay, which I recommend if you don't know it, in this OUP series, a very short introduction. So this has just come out last year. And this is what you can see what he says. Historical distance enters studies of the Enlightenment only in the early 20th century. His literary historians like Lanson were the first to apply scholarship to the question of the revolution's internal origin. So, in other words, there is John Robertson as a historian of the Enlightenment, recognizing that Lanson is the first person to really think about the Enlightenment with historical distance. A footnote to that, Lanson doesn't use the word lumière in French. He uses phrases like esprit philosophique or esprit critique, but he means la lumière, or something very close to it. And of course, Lanson's pupils include Daniel Mornay, who published Les Origines Intellectuelles de la Révolution in 1933, and of course Paul Hazard, who a bit later, just before the Second World War, publishes the Crise de la Conscience Européenne, which I think had a big reception in English. So then the next picture that's just a picture of Voltaire. While I move on to the next part of the talk, what happens going forward in the 20th century? Well. One thing that happens, of course, is that in the mid-years of the century, Diderot emerges as a really major figure of the Enlightenment who had not previously been very much studied. Probably the single figure who most caused that change was the great Enlightenment scholar Franco Venturi. And Franco Venturi, of course born in Italy, he studied in Paris in the 1930s. And he heard Mornay and Hazard lecture in the Sorbonne. So Venturi was exposed to Lanson's pupils. So he knows about all this tradition of Lanson, interested in Enlightenment. But he takes something different away from it, and he pushes very much a new interest in Diderot, who was very much ignored really by Lanson. And already the young Venturi publishes in French in Paris, Page inédite contre un tyran, which is an anthology of Diderot texts in 1937. And his thesis, which is still read and used, the Jeunesse de Diderot, de 1713 à 1753, so a study of Diderot's early materialist thought, which Venturi publishes in Paris in French in 1939. Then after the war, he will publish in Italian a book on the origins of the encyclopedia. So Venturi very much, he doesn't get interested in Voltaire, against the lectures he's heard. He pushes Diderot, and he pushes very much Diderot because of his enthusiasm, which comes from Shaftesbury. It's a very different emphasis. It's a different Enlightenment from Voltairean reason and irony. So that meant that in the post-war years, a lot of Enlightenment scholarship focused on Diderot as the most interesting, you could say, radical thinker. Particularly, there was a lot of emphasis on Diderot's materialism and atheism. So this is prefiguring a little bit the Israel thesis. And the effect of emphasizing Diderot's materialism had the tendency, of course, of making Voltaire seem a much more moderate figure. There was a very major, there was another, I suppose this is just a parenthesis, but it's an old human parenthesis. There have been some very great scholars of Voltaire round about just before the Second World War. One was Ascoli, who was a Jewish pupil of Lanson, taught at the École Normale Supérieure. Another was Raymond Nave, who was a brilliant young Voltaire scholar who got a professorship at Toulouse before the war and would have grown to being a towering Voltaire scholar. And both died in wartime. Ascoli was chucked out from the Sorbonne by his colleagues because he was Jewish, so the Germans arrested him. He died in a camp with his wife. His 3 sons escaped. Nave led the resistance in Toulouse and was designated to be the mayor of Toulouse when the city was liberated, and someone in the cell betrayed him and he was arrested and he died in a camp. So the 2 great Voltaire scholars of 1939 die in camps, which is a pretty sort of awful comment on Voltairean values. And into that gap after the war there was a Voltaire scholar called René Pommel. I can't, if this is being recorded, I can't really say what I think. But anyway, he wasn't, should we say, a scholar of the same stature of the people who died in the camps. And he wrote a thesis which was published, a really important thesis that was published in 1956. And it was called La Religion de Voltaire, Voltaire's Religion. I think the thesis was defended in about 54 or 55. It was published in 56. And when the thesis was defended at the Sorbonne in the mid-1950s, it actually made the front page of Le Monde. And it made the front page of Le Monde because the title was thought to be so astonishing, Voltaire's Religion. In other words, the drift of Pommel's thesis is to say that far from being the violent and virulent anti-Catholic that he's always portrayed as, Voltaire was a sincere believing deist. And in fact, and so what Pommel does is to go through Voltaire's hugely long writings and prove how, at every stage, Voltaire believes in some form of supreme being. And of course, the overall effect is to make Voltaire totally acceptable to Catholics. There are lots of things, there are many ways in which one could argue against the thesis. One could say that in terms of history of ideas, Pommel's analysis doesn't really do much to contextualize the ideas he discusses. You could also say that in terms of literary analysis, he quotes the ideas sometimes rather superficially, he doesn't always analyse the text. So it's not clear that Pommel always deals with irony very successfully. But either way, Pommel's thesis had huge influence, not least because he became the dominant professor of Voltaire studies, and in the next generation, everyone who wrote on Voltaire studied with him, and it was impossible to critique him. So Voltaire studies were entirely dominated by this particular way of approaching the text. So, in a sense, the attempt to present Voltaire as someone who was deliberately not a radical figure, who shouldn't frighten French Catholics, happens before you get to the idea of Jonathan Israel's Radical Enlightenment. And of course, my title was an allusion to Jonathan Israel without wanting to be entirely about that. But of course, when you get to the thesis of Jonathan Israel's books, that the Enlightenment should be defined as this divide between Spinozan materialism and deism, inevitably, if you take that as your defining definition of Enlightenment, of course, it puts Voltaire on the moderate side, and it puts someone like Diderot on the radical side. And I suppose what I've been trying to say here is that, of course, it's a thesis I don't personally entirely agree with, and we'll come on to that at the end, but Israel, he wasn't the first one to say, no, what Israel is doing is it very much builds on what had been happening in Pommel's thesis, what Venturi had done. It even goes back to Lanson. So in some ways, I think one can say that Israel's thesis is a culmination of a whole series of movements that have been going around really since the early 1900s. And he's not alone either. So one shouldn't only focus on Jonathan Israel. There's another book, which is quite interesting, you may know it, by Dennis Rasmussen, which came out from Cambridge in 2014. He teaches in the United States. It's called The Pragmatic Enlightenment. And you can tell the agenda from the title of the full title. It's The Pragmatic Enlightenment, Recovering the Liberalism of Hume, Smith, Montesquieu and Voltaire. So this is an attempt to reclaim Hume, Smith, Montesquieu and Voltaire as pragmatic enlighteners against the radicals who were so extreme that they didn't actually succeed in achieving change. So there's quite a powerful head of steam behind this idea that Voltaire is not really the radical that the revolution in the 19th century thought he was. And I thought I'd just quote this as one example. So this is an article which I admire very much by Antoine Lilti, I'm afraid attacking Jonathan Israel. But the reason I'm quoting him is not because I want to get involved in the fight on Jonathan Israel, because I think the argument is interesting. So this is Lilti disagreeing broadly with the Israel thesis that there is a radical enlightenment that is defined entirely by attachment or not to Spinozan materialism. Another way of thinking what the production of texts and ideas that could seem radical in the 18th century would be to ask about the practical connection of these authors with the established order. That's to say, authors' choice of writing and publication, so decisions about the way you write and the way you publish. One could pose the hypothesis that the true novelty of the Lumière, the Enlightenment, in terms of free thought, is not so much a matter of doctrine, but is more about, assuming it's more about assuming the, I should have done this translation in advance, assuming the public use of the space of scholarship, of heterodox ideas. It's less the content of free thought that is new than the fact of thinking free thought in terms of combat, and therefore thinking about conditions of publication. So that wasn't a very fluent translation or paraphrase I gave you there. But what Lilti is saying is that enlightenment is not merely a matter of individual articles of faith or thought, but it's much more about the way you write, the way you publish, and of course, to say a bit more crudely what he says there, is taking up those ideas to a much broader public as part of a combat. So it's not a totally new idea. People have often said that Voltaire was a passeur d'idées, or someone who spread ideas, but I think Lilti puts it in a much tighter way, and it is a very powerful argument, I think, against the Israel thesis. Israel did then go on to publish a response to this, which is actually not at all persuasive. It doesn't really take account of the arguments at all. So what I will do now, if I talk for another 10 minutes, is that okay? I didn't quite look when I said if I talk for another 5 or 10 minutes, is that good? And then we turn it into a discussion. So what I've tried to do first of all is to set up the way in which Voltaire's radicalism has historically shifted. Clearly seen as the radical figure in his lifetime in the 50s and 60s. Even more radicalised in the Revolution when he becomes an anti-monarchical figure, which he certainly wasn't. A hugely radical figure through the 19th century, where he's the emblem against the Catholic Church, up until about 1900. And then for a variety of reasons, largely to do with pedagogy and the need to teach enlightened values of a certain sort, or to make them appropriate for teaching, there's been an attempt to sort of marginalise the radical status, which is very much enshrined by the way Israel talks about enlightenment. And I think that Lilti, when he writes here, is not talking specifically about Voltaire at all, but I think the things that Lilti says are very, very interesting for rethinking how Voltaire might be important or interesting. First of all, something like the Callas affair, very quickly. You probably know about this, so I'm saying things you know. Callas was a merchant, killed, tortured and executed in the most appallingly cruel way in the early 1760s. Voltaire, it was clear that the judges had not followed proper procedure. It seemed very likely that the judges who were Catholic, Toulouse was pretty extreme Catholic in Voltaire's terms, had put the man to death because he was a Protestant, and Voltaire launches this extraordinary public campaign to get Callas pardoned, not least because his wife, his widow and children, of course, under the terms of the punishment, were destitute, because the widows couldn't inherit their own money. So Voltaire begins a campaign to protect the family, and it's brilliant in terms of he writes lots of different texts. So this is thinking about Lilti's question about the choix de l'écriture, the choix de publication. Voltaire is brilliant at writing brochures and letters and short, sharp texts that have huge impact. And then he writes a bigger text, which is the Traité sur la tolérance, the Treatise on Toleration. It's specifically out of the Callous affair that this is written. A book that's had a lot of sales in Paris since the Charlie Hebdo killings, but it was originally written as a response to the Callous affair. It recounts the history of the Callous affair and then sets it in a broader historical context. So it's a very hard-hitting attack on the lunacy, the absurdity of religious intolerance. Not done from the point of view of a philosophical arguing about toleration, but done from the point of view of a historian. Historical arguments that just show over and over again the stupidity of certain human actions. The impact of the Traité sur la tolérance in France and all across Europe is absolutely huge. I haven't really got time to go into it here, but it is read, it is translated, people respond to it. Voltaire has a public response unlike anything that he previously published, I think it was fair to say. And the Callous affair teaches Voltaire whole new things. He becomes effectively the patriarche de Ferney. I think I just had that as an image. That's Hubert. That was how Voltaire is seen in the 1760s, as the patriarch of Ferney. And he's referred to as the patriarch of Ferney, not just in France, but in the press in England, in Italy. And his books are translated into Polish, into Russian, into Spanish, into Danish. At this point, Voltaire has a European reading public. No writer before him had such resonance across so many countries in so many languages. So to go very quickly, I mean, he understands, first of all, it's a practical lesson in understanding public opinion. I mean, when we teach Enlightenment to our students, we talk about the public space and Habermas and public opinion. But here you can see it in Voltaire's correspondence. He actually, as he watches the response to his writings on the Callous affair, he understands public opinion in practice. And there are great comments in his letters. He talks about the power of opinion in 1763. In 1764, he writes, "Opinion is all-powerful." He writes in a letter in 64, "Opinion rules the world, but in the long run it is the philosophers who shape opinion." So suddenly, as a result of the Callous affair, he really practically understands what a writer can do with public opinion. There's a very interesting, so the Callous affair becomes the first of several affairs. He then takes up, in the course of the 1760s, other defences of injustice. There's the La Barre affair, the Servan affair, there's a whole string of them. Some of you may be familiar with the work of the sociologist Elisabeth Claverie, and she wrote a wonderful article a few years back trying to explain from a sociological standpoint what the affair is. And she really says that Voltaire invents the affair in the Ancien Régime. And some of you may know more than I do about the jurisprudence of the Ancien Régime. But she points out that under the Ancien Régime, justice was carried out in the name of the king, always and it was in strict secrecy, because it was the king's secrecy. Secrecy, in fact, is the theme of the CSEX conference that's starting now. And an Ancien Régime justice was officially a state secret. If you were accused of a crime under the Ancien Régime, you didn't have, when you defended yourself, you didn't have a right to know of the accusations against you. That was the way in which it was made secret. Also, people of different social status were treated differently. That was, again, there were different punishments for people of a certain social standing. That was part of the Ancien Régime. And what Elisabeth Claverie says is, of course, is that Voltaire's writings on the Callous affair turn all that inside out. Everything that had been secret becomes public. There is no longer a divide between public and private and secret and state. Equally, the differences in social status are ironed out. The effect of Voltaire's writing is, of course, is a levelling effect. So it's quite a... So in inventing the affair, Voltaire is actually turning inside out the very fundamental principles of Ancien Régime justice. Now, to go back to the limited quotation, of course, that could be a way in which a writer can have a radical effect. And to be honest, taking criteria like do you or do you not follow Spinoza materialism isn't necessarily what is most radical when you're dealing with Ancien Régime justice, or it's not what most worried the government and the authorities. There was an attempt to... oops, what happened there? Sorry, something's gone wrong. There's a problem with... do that later. That's good. I went to a lecture once where someone showed their holiday snaps. It was a bit embarrassing.
Could be worse.
It could be more embarrassing. So this is the Callas family. So this is the widow, Madame Callas, and the daughters. So this is the mother and the daughters. These are people who are imprisoned, and so this shows the sentimental plight of the Callas family, who need money, who are made destitute because of the intolerance of the Toulouse judges. You get the idea. Now this print was sold. For once, Voltaire didn't have the initiative. It was Diderot who got the idea that they would produce this print and sell it to make money for the Callas family. And it was sort of adverts in the English press saying, "Help the poor Callas family." Everyone knew about it because of Voltaire's writings, and people subscribed to the print. It's the one occasion when Voltaire slightly loses the publishing initiative. This is done from Paris by Diderot. But Voltaire lets it be known that he will subscribe to 10 copies of the engraving, so he tries to pull the rug a bit back towards him. I think I've talked very quickly about public opinion, how Voltaire invents the affair. What happens in the course of the 1760s is that Voltaire, who had been very, very famous, he goes beyond that. Voltaire actually in this process becomes a celebrity. And actually, I'm not obsessed with Antoine Lilty, but Antoine Lilty's second book is about celebrity. And the first chapter's on Voltaire as the first modern celebrity. And in fact, I think that is what happens in the process of working through the Callas affair. Voltaire begins to understand that when you're a celebrity, you can say things and do things. I think it's Chamfort who says, the aphorist of the period, who says celebrity is being known to people that you don't know yourself. Rather a snobby idea, but you get the idea. So this is Voltaire as a celebrity. This is a painting. This is the patriarch of Ferney getting out of bed, putting on his trousers. It's almost indecent, but not quite. And of course, all the details are terribly nice. He's got out of bed. The bed is not made. There's a book by the bed, it's unread, he's in the middle of a book. There's a chamber pot, it's all very, very homely. This is the secretary, so he's dictating a letter to his secretary. There's a dog. So the whole thing is, this was made as a print, sold all across Europe. It's called Le Lever de Voltaire. Now normally, of course, you have Le Lever du Roi. So Le Lever de Voltaire, this is Voltaire, Le Roi Voltaire. This is Voltaire getting up, as he gets up, he's dictating a letter. He's writing another letter about the Callas affair, whatever it is. Do you notice the picture over the bed? It's an engraving. If you just look at that, it's hard to see, but can you see the configuration of the characters in the engraving? Does it remind you of anything?
Yes.
It's that. He's got the Callas affair engraving is over his bed. So this is the way of telling Europe, even though it's comical, it's presenting Voltaire as a sort of comic figure, he's got that engraving over his bed. So this is the point at which Voltaire has become a celebrity. He can make fun of himself. This image goes all the way across Europe. It's engraved not once, but multiple times. And the hero of the Callas affair has basically become a celebrity. I think I'm going to stop there. And it's a question, I think Voltaire always the great performer. What we really show at this point, Voltaire has become an actor. He's performing the role of being the radical. And what, of course, is so interesting is that when he becomes a true celebrity rather than just famous, he actually becomes unattackable. In a way, whereas Diderot, for example, was always afraid of being sent to prison again, or d'Alembert was always scared that he might overstep the mark, get into trouble. By the end of Voltaire's life, I don't think the government could have done very much to him. He becomes literally unattackable. He's so famous. And that is the true sense of celebrity, that he actually cannot be touched. At the end of his life, he goes to Paris. He's dying. He hasn't been in Paris for 27 years. He goes to the Comédie Française. There is a performance of Irène, which is a really bad late tragedy. Voltaire is in the theatre. That is Voltaire in the loge, watching him. His own bust is brought onto the stage, and the leading actress, Mademoiselle Vestris, reads a poem, and all the actors of the play crown the bust of Voltaire with a laurel wreath. So he becomes a legend in his own lifetime. Now the point about this is an engraving. It was drawn, and this engraving is immediately sold across Europe. So again, it's called Le Couronnement de Voltaire. So Le Roi Voltaire is now crowned, but he's crowned almost in death. He dies weeks later. He dies in May. So in a way, and the fact this is very theatrical, the whole thing happens in the stage of the Comédie Française, the state theatre. The fact that he's he's known to be l'homme aux calas, the man who has challenged Ancien Regime, judicial processes, caused quite a lot of hassle to the government, and yet he receives this extraordinary honour on the stage of the state theatre. And you can only get away with that if you're a very, very, well, you need to be a celebrity. An ordinary mortal just couldn't get away with it. I'll just finish by saying there's an actor of the period called Fleury, who in his memoirs at the end of this ceremony, Voltaire leaves the theatre. He's a very, very old man. He gets in a cab to go back to his house. And the crowd followed him. Apparently this is said to be true. This is how Fleury writes it up in his memoirs. I've translated it. As Voltaire's carriage was turning by the Rue du Bac, a crowd of bare-armed workmen came out of their workshop. Why are they in their workshop at 10 o'clock at night? Anyway, workmen came out of their workshop to see the procession. These are the people chasing Voltaire's cab. I confess they didn't seem fully to appreciate his standing as a writer. For them, Voltaire was a philosopher. That is to say, in their minds, an enemy of priests. They ran after him, rushing at his carriage, throwing their hats in the air, crying out amidst all the other cries, "Long live the defender of Calas, long live the defender of Sirven." That's another affair. Fanaticism and intolerance dared show themselves only in secret. And perhaps for the first time in France, we saw public opinion assume fully its proper place. It's a fantastic scene, isn't it? I'm sure it's totally imagined, but it's a wonderfully written text. So, of course, the thing we can now talk about in the discussion is what do we mean by radical? What is radical? What are the different senses of radical? But I just thought I'd finish on that quotation. I love this quotation from Galliani, who was a Neapolitan economist, enlightened thinker, writes to Madame d'Épinay in Paris, "Voltaire is feared and he has claws, and that is sufficient. To soar over the top of everyone else and to have claws, that is the lot of the great genius." So I suppose my conclusion is to say, do you agree that having claws is enough to be a radical? Thank you very much.
So we'd like to invite questions for Nicholas Cronk. Yes.
Of the historiographical names that we get with Lasson and Hazard and then ultimately Israel and his famous argument, but a name that doesn't come up in your discussion is Darnton. But in some ways, it seems like you are reviving some of that, Voltaire's new publication, or at least in your interpretation of Lilty and trying to situate that, is that now maybe it's about the nature of publishing and the nature of how the ideas are disseminated. And so is this sort of, is radicalism now in the cultural or the social history of the ideas?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Obviously I was trying to cover a lot of ground a bit too fast, but you're right, I suppose that probably Lilty himself must be influenced by Darnton, must he? So I think you're right, it's a book history slant. If you look at the book history slant, then I agree with you, actually. I mean, one of the things I have to do as an editor of the Complete was we write the history of all the texts we publish, and we go into how each individual Voltaire text is reprinted and so on. And the stories are absolutely amazing. That's where Voltaire is different from all the other writers of the period. I mean, it's the sheer number of editions. And he has a genius for sort of, and that's all to do, again, with the fame veering into celebrity. That, I mean, text, it's not, you say, de l'Esprit des Lois by once it's published, it comes out and there are 2 reprints. But when you say of some pamphlet, like the Toast de la Tolerance, it's published, I mean, there's a ton of publications. So if you try and work out the number, you can do a guess, each edition was maybe 2,000 copies, and if you can find 20 editions, or you can work out the number of thousands of copies that are just flooding the market, it must be reaching, it would seem to be reaching a bigger readership. So it is about the number of people who get to the texts, and also the way that he creates. He's an absolute genius. I didn't really go into this, but he's a genius at creating expectation for texts. So he writes a text and then writes to friends and says, "Do you know I've written on this? But I shouldn't show it to you." And they say, "No, send it to me." And so he gets people actually, even for the Toast de la Tolerance, even Hume writes to him from Paris. And David Hume and says, "I've heard you've written this. Basically, can I see it? I can't get hold of a copy." So it's a brilliant coup to actually create such a demand for your writing that people, and then of course people copy copies, they pirate copies. And whereas for other writers, pirating is a problem, for Voltaire it's not. It's actually part of the process by which you get the message out. He deliberately does things so that he gets pirated. He sends a poem to D'Alembert, praising Christian VII in the early 1770s for freedom of press in Denmark. And he sends it to, having built this up and up and up, he writes to him and says, I'm terrified this will get out and be published, so please don't have it copied. And within a week, it's copied everywhere, it's in the press and so on. So it's clearly, he's using, you're right, it is a dollar, he's using the book market.
And he writes an anonymous biography of himself.
And he writes an anonymous biography of himself, he writes about himself in the third person.
Yeah, actually, I was quite interested in the point about celebrity, which I gather reading that quote actually seems like it's a kind of variation of the Habermas argument about the public sphere.
Yes.
Anyways, but I guess my point is I read Voltaire's piece of representations on Rousseau and celebrity, and
yes.
and what struck me is the contrast, of course, which Voltaire himself would engineer between the success of his celebrity and the problematic nature of Rousseau's celebrity. And in some ways, Rousseau seems to be a kind of counter-argument to your point about how celebrity, once you have celebrity, you can do anything, whereas Rousseau's celebrity only got him into trouble, it seems like. Can you say something about why some celebrity succeeds and why Rousseau fails?
I think you'd have, the first thing, the starting point would be, if you look at all the philosophes, the two great celebrities are Voltaire and Rousseau.
Right.
And what is interesting is that Diderot is so bad at it. Diderot, who could have been, he doesn't project himself at all. There's no self-representative Diderot, really. And a lot of his most radical texts he just left in manuscript. The Jacques le Fataliste, and the Rêve d'Alembert, they were unpublished in his lifetime. So Diderot is the sort of degré zéro, where he just writes what he thinks, publishes what he can get away with, and leaves the rest in manuscript. Voltaire and Rousseau are probably the first two great celebrities in French literature. And I think, if I was going to take the liberty idea a bit further, I think actually they construct themselves against each other. Maybe I'd love to write a book actually. I need to do it with the Diderot scholar, the Rousseau scholars. I don't know the Rousseau well enough, but I think that they each construct a persona that sort of needs the other in order to attack. So in other words, put very simply, Rousseau says, one of the big issues was, do you sign books or not? If you're trying to publish a heterodox idea and there's censorship, well, you publish anonymously. Everyone does. You publish anonymously, and the police have got to prove that you wrote it. So when De l'Esprit comes out in 1757, Helvétius gets into huge trouble. And someone writes to Voltaire and says, isn't it sad about Helvétius? And Voltaire replies, what on earth possessed him to put his name on the title page? Why on earth did you sign the book? For Voltaire it was just obvious, you play the game. So Rousseau says, I will always sign everything I write. So he refuses to publish anonymously or to use pseudonyms. So everything is signed, Georges Rousseau, Citoyen de Genève at a certain point. And so I am the sort of, this is me, I project myself, I sign what I write. And Voltaire is the exact opposite. Voltaire just thinks you get it out there. And he publishes anonymously, he has hundreds of pseudonyms. And there are pseudonyms that are actually real pseudonyms that cover his identity, a few. And there are others that completely proclaim his identity. So there's a pamphlet published and it's signed by the Archbishop of Novgorod. Everyone immediately knows that it's Voltaire. Only Voltaire would sign the Archbishop of Novgorod. So, so that he plays with all that, and he does things, and he plays with the censor. I think the two sorts of celebrity. Yes, I'm not entirely answering your question because I'm still thinking about it. But I think that probably the Rousseau celebrity is his celebrity is really about him in it, isn't it? And it's about and the posture that he's creating is the posture of a little bit the outsider. Well, not a little bit. It is. It's the posture of the outsider. Whereas what Voltaire, in a way, you could argue, although it's monstrously egotistical, that it's a less egotistical authorial posture. He's actually trying to get an authorial voice that attacks certain ways of thinking.
Yeah, like in some ways it seems like Voltaire instinctively figures out how to, cunningly operate in what Habermas and others call the new public sphere. Rousseau is never comfortable. I mean, and in fact, if I gather, the first interaction is over the theater in Geneva when Rousseau publishes his pamphlet, and Voltaire denounces Rousseau and then leaks the information about Rousseau's children being abandoned to an orphanage, and that really gets him and he becomes widely known for that. But it seems like he's already figured out how to manipulate the public sphere to undercut his enemies.
And the Voltaire also, they go on getting at each other. So in the Confession, there's a wonderful phrase where Rousseau says of Voltaire in the 1760s that he was weighed down by fame and prosperity. such a vicious phrase.
But also, just if I can interject there too, I mean, their use of genre is very different. So, where Voltaire really knows the value of making a name for himself as in theater.
Right.
And,
Right.
and the mask,
Right.
So, who am
Right.
I? Who am I really talking about? At least,
Yeah.
from my perspective, and Rousseau is not,
Yeah,
he's not doing
he's
that.
really
He's an
uncomfortable with
essayist.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And,
Well, he wrote an opera though.
well, that I did not.
Yeah.
But actually, I think the thing about the point of the theatre is really interesting, and that's partly why I showed that image, that within the Ancien regime, the theatre was the way you became, it was a state institution of the Comédie Française, founded by Louis XIV. So it was really the way in which an author had social status.
But you also had an international stage.
And
Rome
absolutely.
was one of the big high points on the international French theatre tour, so it was actually outside of France itself.
Yeah. It also seems like Voltaire didn't have a problem with elite institutions, like that first painting, the Le Monnier of the Salon, and then in the theater, whereas Rousseau, of course, wrote against these institutions. And I wonder if that figures into it, that in some ways it makes him acceptable in a way that Rousseau people are always ambivalent about.
Voltaire plays with the establishment, and he doesn't actually want to totally alienate them. So if you go into the detailed sort of history of the Calais affair, the real triumph is that he gets, so it begins in 1761, the execution is in 61. By 63, because of these brilliant pamphlets, he gets the Privy Council at Versailles to overrule the court in Toulouse, who'd only ever executed Calais by a majority of 5 to 8 or something. It was a very strange, it had never been a very clear majority anyway. But of course the clever thing wasn't that he just said these Toulouse judges are ghastly and they're fanatics and so on, that's what he thought, but it was getting the Paris court to overrule the provincial court. And of course that just played to a certain sense in Paris that we're superior to these provincials, who were all sort of not so clever. So it was getting one bit of the Ancien regime to overrule another bit that is really clever, not just attacking the whole system. So I think
He played the church like that.
yeah, he played.
It sort of starts to make it sound like that, Voltaire is the Rameau's nephew. Like maybe Diderot got this too, and he's like, well, this is really how to get this done. Because that mask and that playing with the institutions, I don't know. So it just seems
And he also used aristocratic. There was a very great French scholar who taught at Columbia, Jean Sarret, who was a wonderful Voltaire scholar. And he wrote a book called Voltaire et les Grands, which is a series of essays about Voltaire's relationship with very grand aristocratic figures. And it's all done through the correspondence, which is a great masterpiece in its own right. And he has a lot of aristocratic connections who could potentially be there to protect him if there is trouble, and who can, to some extent, adopt his views. And so you're right, it's a certain sort of complicity with power, where Rousseau
Which
just
actually is the Darwin argument.
yeah. I didn't realise that.
Yeah.
I thought about it,
Some other questions?
Oh, so he was buried or translated his remains to the Pantheon in '91.
Yeah.
Was that, and the inscriptions were set up? At what point did the revolution, disown him or turn against him? Was there never?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's true that it goes on through the tenor, but no, I think it never. He really retains that sort of that position as a and texts are published by Voltaire. And of course it's extraordinary because Voltaire was a monarchist.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a supporter, and if you think of the Siècle Louis XIV, which is a great piece of writing, it's a defence of a monarch who'd been really unpopular. The monarch who revoked the Edict of Nantes. So it was quite a radical rewriting of history. But he was never, I think then when it gets to the terror, things move so fast. I don't think they could ever.
You had a question?
Yeah, one's very aware of the disciplinary perspective in all of this. That if you look at the question, from an epistemological, point of view, then you come up with a kind of Israel perspective. But then if you look at it from the social perspective, then it's different. But I mean, if you look at Voltaire from our perspective, which is the German one, Voltaire figures largely in this canonical work, Lessing's Hamburg Dramaturgy, as the mediocre establishment. Page after page, Lessing is bashing away this poor writing in the Voltaire tragedies, without any recognition at all of his kind of social or philosophical import. Whereas Diderot is the guy who emerges as the hero of that, the person who pioneers
the Don Bourgeois.
the domestic drama. That's right. So I mean, it's just.
I suppose I don't know much about Lessing, but I suppose he has a vestige. He's arguing against classical tragedy probably as a form. So he wants the reform of theatre.
Yes.
The problem with that view, and that used to be the standard view that Voltaire was pushing a genre, classical tragedy, that was really already sort of dead. George Steiner, Death of Tragedy, basically says that the 18th century can't write tragedy because there's no metaphysical belief in the structure. But the problem with that view is that actually it's defined by the public. That's to say that Lessing has his own particular view, but Voltaire's tragedies were the most performed tragedies all across Europe in the 18th century, not just in France. They go into England, they go into Denmark, they go into Italy, Spain, Russia. Voltaire's tragedies are performed at the Russian court by both in Russian and in French. So they are and they continue to be performed really right into the 19th century, and they're vehicles for big stars. Sarah Bernhardt from the 1880s, one of her big roles was Zaire. She did this. She was famous. She did this incredibly melodramatic death that everyone knew about. And when she came to London for the first time, London had heard about Sarah Bernhardt. They wanted to see her, and she brings Zaire. She does Zaire on the stage in London. Everyone watches her die. So she was the great star who wanted vehicles. She chose Voltaire's tragedies. So the Lessing view it's a perspective. It's not. It is. We forget that actually this theatre had sort of gaps in it till about 1900, and then it just falls way after that.
It sort of supports what you were saying about Lanson and his heirs. In a sense, our view of the past is created by the scholars.
Yes.
And they have ulterior motives in mind. Their own positioning of their discipline, their institution. But this is very much the creation of the classical, Germanistic curriculum.
Yes.
Right.
Edited
and, put this book on required reading lists, for generations. Yeah. Should be interesting.